Rationally Speaking podcast. I am your host, Massimo, and with me is my co-host, Julia Gilliff. Julia, what exactly are we going to do today?
Well, Massimo, for those of you listening at home, we are here with a live studio audience live studio audience. In the scenic Rose Nagelberg Theater at Baruch University in New York City. And we are delighted to have a guest here with us. I expect many or most of you already know Steve Novella. He is a clinical neurologist and professor at Yale University School of Medicine. He runs the blog Science-Based Medicine and NeuroLogica. And he's also the co-host of a little podcast that's a good second choice if you run out of Rationally Speaking episodes to listen to. It's called Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And we're very happy to have you here with us today. Let's give Steve a hand.
Thanks, pleasure to be here.
Oh, and I forgot to mention that Steve and Massimo are working on a book together. It's in progress right now. Working title is Scientific Skepticism. So hopefully that'll be one of the themes that we touch on today.
Yeah, so Steve, what's been going on since you've been sued?
Wow, dove right in there, Massimo. I was going to ease into it, but...
No.
Well, I mean, fortunately, I don't have much to do with this in terms of day-to-day with the suit, except to pay all the lawyers who are doing all the work. But that's the
fun part.
That's the fun part, yeah, the painful part. I'm actually surprised it took this long, frankly, given the number...
So am I, actually.
Number of people that I criticize very sharply online. I'm surprised it took me this long, but so there's a physician, Dr. Tobenik, who, in my opinion, is offering treatments which are not based upon solid evidence and making claims that are going beyond the evidence. He's not a neurologist, but he's treating neurological disease. So I was very critical of the treatments that he's offering, and he has a history of suing people who criticize him. So.
And what is exactly that he's offering?
So he
claims to be offering?
He's using an FDA-approved drug called Enbrel, which is approved for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, to treat things like stroke and Alzheimer's disease. So his argument is that these are ultimately inflammatory, and that this is a powerful anti-inflammatory drug can be used to treat them. Not a crazy idea. It's just you have to, we need to test that idea, and you need to do clinical evidence. Which he doesn't have. So there's just the most preliminary type of evidence, which doesn't tell you anything. You can't base any efficacy claims on that. That's what we write about that every day on Science-Based Medicine. And he took exception to our conclusions. What's interesting, I'm not worried about losing because, in my opinion, his case is frivolous. His argument is that my blog post was an advertisement, which is transparent nonsense.
But an advertisement for reason, duh.
Well, I think his claim is that it was an advertisement for my own practice, which I don't even really treat stroke in my practice. No, it's just wrong on every level. But he had to argue that in order to sue on the Lanham Act, which has to do with commercial speech. Because otherwise, his burden would be a lot higher because we have that whole free speech thing, First Amendment rights in this country. So it's just a legal maneuver. And in my opinion, he's just trying to get this as far as he can to cause as much pain as possible to try to intimidate me into taking down the post, which I'm not going to do. So we got to ride it through.
Now, this is definitely not the first time that something like that happened. There was a famous case, was a couple of years ago in England?
Yeah, Simon Singh, you're talking about? Yeah, so Simon was sued by the British Chiropractic Association for saying that they happily promote bogus therapies, which I think is a perfectly fair statement to make. And he, again, stood his ground. And in England, it's actually a lot worse by an order of magnitude than in the United States. But fortunately, he had the resources, again, to ride the suit all the way through. And which one of the good things is that the skeptical community does sort of rally behind people when they are targeted in this way, which is important. I don't think we would have the resources to go the distance unless we were being supported by the community.
Well, that's part of the idea of a community as opposed to just people.
So speaking of, is there anything that Rationally Speaking listeners can do to support you guys here?
Yeah, well, absolutely. If you go to the skepticsguide.org, you'll see there links to make donations to we have a separate legal defense fund, so we absolutely will just take straight up donations to support our legal fees. Right now, we're running about half. About half of our legal fees are being covered by donations, which is great. But there's a long way to go, though. And we've had offers of free legal help and stuff, which is great. That's always tricky, of course, because you don't can't have too many people in the mix. And I do have a very good attorney who's an expert on First Amendment law, and it's kind of the moving parts are fairly complicated, so we wouldn't want to be switching around midstream, So.
I mean, this whole area seems like such an outrage and so unfair that people speaking out against injustices can be intimidated, and probably a lot of people don't have the resources or even necessarily the following to drum up those resources. Is there anything that other skeptics with blogs or podcasts or who want to speak out against this stuff can do to protect themselves, or is it just it comes with the territory?
You can get liability insurance. Which
did you?
I have liability insurance, but it's covering only part of the suit, so it'll reduce how much it's costing me, but not to nothing, unfortunately. So so if you get a good liability coverage, because the other thing is I'm being sued individually, and the SGU is being sued, and Science-Based Medicine is being sued, and they also sued Yale, Yale already got themselves dismissed from the case, which is great. So. Each entity would need to have its own liability coverage. So that's part of the problem of having multiple, venues, is that you could be exposed in many different ways. So that's why it's a little bit tricky in my particular case, but it did help a little bit in terms of covering all the costs, because Science-Based Medicine had liability insurance, so that piece of it is being covered, and that did cover me a little bit as well. So that's one way to do it, is to, first of all, know if you do get sued, you need to already know who are you going to contact as your legal representative or somebody to give you immediate legal advice. You need to at least know ahead of time who that person can be. And if you have, liability insurance, that will definitely cover you. But, the insurance companies are tricky too, because their goal is to limit they hire a lawyer to limit their own liability. They may tell you, we want you to take down the post because that's going to end the case. So their interests are not your
battles now for each of your entities.
Yeah, so their interests are not always your interests. So if you decide, well, I want to fight this and not cave in, to the intimidation here, then that you may have to pay for the privilege of fighting all the way through, even if you have some kind of coverage. So, as you say, we end up spending tens of thousands of dollars just to exercise your First Amendment rights, and there is no way around that. That's just what it costs.
The funny thing is, actually, these things happen. Often they don't get to this level of, actually in court, in a court case. But threats like that happen all the time. I mean, a few years ago, I got one of these because of an article that I published in Skeptic magazine about, so let me give the background. A few years ago, I organized a workshop for scientists. This was a technical stuff at the University of Vienna. And this journalist thought that when she found out, that she was on this scoop of all these evolutionary biologists who met secretly to plot against the rest of the world and that sort of stuff. So she wrote what she called an expose of this thing. And I wrote a response on Skeptic magazine telling exactly how this happened and how she interviewed me and that sort of stuff. She actually contacted both University of Chicago Press, which was the publisher, my publisher at the time, the Skeptic article was included in one of my books, Nonsense on Tills, and also my dean at the university, and claiming that she was going to sue, and unless they respectfully withdrew the book and my ability to speak freely outside of the university. And it was a great, I still have a copy of both the letters that I got from the editor at Chicago Press and from my dean, and they were just beautiful examples of how you actually deal with this kind of stuff if you actually care about free speech. And of course, she had no case whatsoever to go to court. But I suspect that these kind of things happen much more often than we hear about.
They do, and I know a lot of cases where people that have written for me for science-based medicine or whatever, some connection to me, have gotten the initial intimidating take this down or you're going to get sued, and they take it down because they couldn't afford to defend themselves even against a frivolous suit. And it's a huge calculus, am I going to spend $100,000 just to keep this one post up? Is that worth that much? I mean, for us, like at science-based medicine, if we cave into even, I think, one case where we might as well close up shop,
right.
We couldn't function doing what we're doing unless we said, we are going to fight any attempt to shut us down as, to the bitter end. Yeah. I just don't think there's any other way to do business. The other way that people might help is lobbying their state legislature, because in the United States, these laws are all state by state.
Of course.
So unless, of course, you're getting sued in federal court, which actually I am. But even then, the state laws still hold. But and there in some states, not all states have what are called anti-SLAPP laws. So a SLAPP is a strategic liability against public participation. So that basically defines a lawsuit, which is essentially designed to inhibit somebody's First Amendment free speech rights. So an anti-SLAPP law says that if you sue somebody in order to suppress their free speech, you are now open to being countersued for that. And if you lose that countersuit, you have to pay their legal fees or twice their legal fees or whatever the law is in any particular state. So, but not every state has that law. But it would be nice if they did, because
you've been suing Connecticut, so is that...
Connecticut doesn't have an anti-SLAPP law.
Of course not.
Yeah, right. But I'm actually being sued in Florida, which also does not have an anti-SLAPP law. But doesn't mean our options are closed. But I don't want to say any more strategically about that. But but it would certainly be nice if if you live in a state with an anti-SLAPP law that absolutely affords you a certain amount of protection, because anybody who tries to sue you frivolously runs a much bigger risk. Yeah.
I'm feeling like comparatively less of a big shot here because I haven't been directly sued. But
or even threatened at this point.
Yeah, but wait, I'm curious if you guys can compete with this. This is like a game of never have I ever. Has anyone here ever had an angry, alleged victim of your alleged libel contact your relatives on Facebook to threaten you?
That happened to you, I know.
Now that you mention it, I do seem to recall. Yes? No?
Never. No.
Yes.
They've only contacted me directly. Yeah. But I do have colleagues who have had their dean, their boss, contacted. Yale's never told me that anyone's done that, so I'm assuming it's never happened.
I'm curious, how did your parents react?
My dad was just befuddled. I don't know.
They said your daughter's being mean to me? I mean, is that what it came down to?
Roughly.
Yeah.
We don't go into all the details, yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah, we don't want to go into the details of this.
Oh, boy.
Although, for the curious, they can check that out on Rationally Speaking, the old blog.
That's true.
The whole story is
actually You can track that
there.
down if you so choose.
Now, speaking of getting in trouble or not getting in trouble, you've written recently about on Skeptical Inquirer about GMOs and why they're not a health problem. So how much money did you get from Monsanto?
Not as much as I should. I don't know if I think I've told this story at another live event. I was actually contacted by a PR person from Monsanto after I wrote an article about GMO. And they're like, oh, we like what you're doing, and maybe we can coordinate. And my response was, never contact me again.
I hope that was in all caps, if there's ever an appropriate use.
Yeah, if you like what I'm doing, just leave me alone. There can't be any connection between me and your company, because that will then forever be used as a way of dismissing any of my opinions about GMO.
That actually seemed like a real novice move on their part. I'm surprised.
It was, yeah.
Well, there go a lot of very high-level speaking fees you just gave up on.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you can't have it both ways, right? I mean, I've given a couple of lectures, totally innocent, very small amount of money, about something in my area of expertise for pharmaceutical companies, right? Because they'll happily pay you, a speaking fee to give a lecture to primary care doctors about migraine medications, things like that. But I stopped doing that, even though I think it's 100% innocent, just because of the perception. Just because I want to be able to say I don't take any money from any pharmaceutical company for anything. It's just cleaner than having to explain, oh, I did get a speaking fee, but it was for this thing, which is innocent. You know what I mean? Right. So it does inhibit actually what I do, just because if I want to have a science communicator, podcasting, whatever career, I just have to keep myself squeaky clean, even when the appearance of impropriety is.
I want to go back to the GMO in a second,
yeah.
but there are similar issues in other about in the skeptic community about other sources of money. Like, for instance, the Templeton Foundation. The Templeton Foundation has approached me directly or indirectly a number of times with a number of different projects, none of which, unfortunately, actually involved a lot of money on their part. But hey, it was a significant amount of money at some point. And since I've been critical of the Templeton Foundation's funding of science type of events,
right,
because, of course, they do have a political and ideological agenda, which actually has gotten worse since Sir Templeton died,
yeah,
I think, in my estimate. But anyway, so I just couldn't do that. And sometimes this was circuitous, because at some point I had to turn down a possibility of writing a book for Yale University Press, because that particular series of books was funded by the Templeton Foundation. And of course the editor said, but we have absolute complete editorial control. I said, I know, but it's a question, it's not I'm trusting you,
right,
it's a question of perception. If I do that, and with having been critical publicly about this thing, and then somebody says, how? So when it's convenient for you, you do it.
Right. Or what if, let's say, for example, Nexus we had an offer of Merck. They wanted to give us a big chunk of cash to sponsor our science conference. Yeah. Or rationally speaking, you got an offer from a pharmaceutical company. Coming in and out here. You'd have to think very carefully about the pluses and minuses of that. And even if it was totally unattached to anything and totally innocent, forever you would be funded by the pharmaceutical industry, and it would kill your editorial indendence.
Yeah, it does come down to how much money they offer.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the
best cure for temptation is a locked door.
Right.
Actually, before we go back to the GMO issue in particular, I wanted to zoom out a little bit, because Steve, you and I were having an interesting conversation just before this taping about a shift in your focus in terms of what kinds of issues you're most interested in tackling recently, of which the GMO issue is a part. So maybe you could say a little bit about what kind of shift this is and why.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Just looking back over the kind of topics that I tended to deal with over the last 18 years now, recently I have spent more of my time dealing with issues that I consider to be like the big science denialism, like anti-science issues that are out there in the culture, like global warming, the anti-vaccine movement, creationism still, that's always been there, and now also what I consider to be anti-science and the anti-GMO organization or group. So what's interesting, I still obviously will write about Bigfoot and UFOs and astrology and things like that, but I think I always try to focus my efforts where I think they're most needed. And I think even within the skeptical movement, even self-identified skeptics have a lot to learn about these issues. And still you will see skeptics who maybe they're politically libertarian who we're in a pause, that global warming is not happening, or skeptics who, also the other issue I think that I always deal with is alternative medicine, and because I think it's still underrepresented within the skeptical movement, writing about alternative medicine, and still an area where I encounter a lot of misconceptions, even among otherwise scientifically literate, well-educated, self-identified skeptics. So I think I do tend to focus on those topics where I think the need is the greatest.
And do you think that other skeptic leaders should also be focusing on the highest impact issues, or is this just a matter of comparative advantage, that you think you have a comparative advantage here, but you don't necessarily think other people should be switching their focus?
I think other people should do whatever the hell they want to do. Well. Seriously, this has to be partly a labor of love. I always I write about every day whatever I want to write about that day, whatever has my interest, and I do tend to gravitate towards areas, things that frustrate me and make me upset. That's what I write about. And when I hear skeptics talking in a way that's maybe naive or uninformed about a topic, it's like, okay, that bothers me. I need to write about that. Other people can write about whatever they want to. I don't have any magic formula about what we should be doing. So I try to stay away from telling other people what they should do.
I'll let them know they have your permission.
Okay, so back to the GMO. So what's the science on that stuff?
Well, it depends. There are sub-questions within there. So one is the health effects, which I think is the easiest question, to be honest with you. The other is the environmental effects, and the other broad area is just the political, the regulation of patenting life, which is the most subjective and the hardest one to come up with a definitive answer, in my opinion. The health effects, which I've that's the topic I first tackled, obviously because I'm a physician. That's where I have the most expertise. I could read the medical literature. I think that there have been hundreds of good quality studies, feeding studies, or a lot of them, but also some human studies, and were observational. And essentially, there is no evidence that there is any health risk to genetically modified organisms that are on the market now. You also have to back up a little bit. GMO is a technology. It's not a thing. It's not a product. So when you say like GMOs are safe, well, you have to qualify that. Like the GMOs that are currently on the market are the ones that we know about. Obviously, you can genetically modify an organism to have a poison in it, and then it wouldn't be safe.
That would be not safe. Right?
Although that has occurred through breeding and hybridization too. Right. So I think a lot of it comes down to why should we think genetically modified crops, for example, would be more likely to be harmful to our health than any other food out there? Mm-hmm. And there are actually some good answers to that, but when you drill down deeply on them, they evaporate. So like one is, well, they're using antibiotic resistance as markers to know when the gene is in the crop. So maybe those antibiotic resistant genes are going to find their way into the bacteria in our gut, and then we're going to have antibiotic resistance and more bacteria. So, okay, at least they're talking about a mechanism.
Right.
But we knew about that 10, 15, 20 years ago, and that issue has been explored pretty thoroughly. And they only use markers that are not relevant to, they wouldn't use a gene for antibiotic resistance to an important antibiotic. So the thing is, there's lots of safety checks in place. The bottom line is that the bacteria in our gut are getting exposed to many more genes for antibiotic resistance than any that they would get exposed to through GMO. And it hasn't and is unlikely to result in any difference in antibiotic resistance in the environment. And so when you explore the issue, it turns out it's really not an issue. It's not a risk. But it's really easy to scare people by saying, hey, you're going to give antibiotic resistance to our, gut bacteria.
Because the argument, that's an interesting example of an argument that actually does make sense. First sight say, okay, yeah, I can see how that will work. It's not, completely made up. And as you said, the devil there, or the old God, is in the details. Yeah. Meaning that, of course, but people have looked into these kind of things, and there are safeguards. One argument that I do hear, however, from skeptics, I'm entirely on board with your take on GMOs from a health perspective. But one argument, I often get frustrated when skeptics themselves give bad arguments. Yeah. So one example outside of the GMO, I ran into a number of years ago when I was actually writing Nonsense on Stilts, because there's a chapter there on UFOs and stuff like that. And you can see several examples of something happened, somebody saw something, and local skeptic groups just listing a number of possible explanations without actually looking into the details, right?
Right.
It must be in a satellite. Well, actually, no, because people actually checked that. It was not a possibility of a satellite. There was an explanation in those cases. It was a natural explanation, but not the first one that sort of immediately, sort of as a knee-jerk reaction, skeptics came up with.
I think it was Dan Dennett who once said, "There's nothing I hate more than a bad argument from my side."
Yeah, exactly.
I feel the same. Just
you undermine your own side. Exactly, you undermine your own credibility that way. In the case of GMOs, for instance, as a biologist, I think that a bad argument is, well, we've been genetically modifying organisms forever through artificial selection. Yes, but we haven't been shuffling around things across kingdoms quite easily as it is done now, and it is reasonable to at least be concerned about the fact that is a qualitatively different thing to do. It's not just like artificial.
I agree. That's a complex argument, although there is a point to be made there. When people are using the naturalistic fallacy in order to attack GMOs, say, well, nothing that you eat is natural, is as it occurred in nature. They're all been transformed beyond recognition. And then there are also breeding technologies that, like, if you're worried about GMO, why aren't you worried about mutation farming, where they're using radioactivity in order to accelerate the genetic mutations in crops so that they have more raw material to select? Then you're getting something that's pretty close, to direct genetic modification. And then also people will make comments such as, I don't want fish genes in my tomatoes, which is that
does sound like it would taste pretty bad.
But it's an anti-evolutionary argument, though, in my opinion, because tomatoes and fish share 60% of their genes. Also, there's
there
fish
are already
genes.
tomatoes, fish genes in your tomatoes.
Yeah. So, but it's like there's something icky about the idea. But it also, when you really think about it, there's no such thing as a fish gene or a tomato gene, right? You can't look at a gene and tell me that gene comes from a tomato.
Genes aren't like little tomato-shaped genes and fish-shaped genes.
They're just genes,
Rocking my world here, man.
Yeah.
Oh man.
And because all life on Earth is related, all the really basic genetics is pretty similar. Like humans and peas share a lot of genes in common for all the basic sort of biochemical stuff that our bodies do. So what does it mean to have a fish gene in your tomato? It doesn't really even mean anything scientifically, biologically, but it's a good talking point if you just want to scare people with an icky kind of, that doesn't feel natural. Ooh, fish genes in my tomato.
Actually, let's return to the naturalistic fallacy briefly, because I suspect actually that you two have been thinking along similar lines recently. I have actually been wanting to write something about how I've been noticing that pointing to fallacies that you think you see is actually usually much more complicated than it seems at first. And so often when someone else, or when sometimes I call something an instance of the naturalistic fallacy or the sunk cost fallacy or the ad hominem fallacy, I realize, well, actually, maybe it is still wrong, but it's not wrong clearly just because it fits the bill of the naturalistic fallacy. So for example, in this case, the naturalistic fallacy, simply put, you could say the genetically modifying foods is bad because it's not natural as an instance of the naturalistic fallacy, and it does fit the description of, the fallacy is calling something bad just because it's not natural. But there are a bunch of other reasons, as Massimo was saying, to think a priori that if we do something, differently than has been working successfully for our species for millennia, then we should be more concerned than our baseline, which isn't to say that it's necessarily wrong. We still have to test it, but that's a good a priori reason for concern. And then, as you point out, there are a bunch of other reasons to notice, we aren't concerned in all these other cases, so we're actually being inconsistent in our application of concern.
Right.
But that's so much more complicated than just saying, well, you can't just say because it's not natural that it's bad, right?
It is, and in a few minutes we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit about the book that Steve and I are working on together, but there is going to be a chapter in that book precisely on that, which is based actually on a technical paper that I co-wrote with Martin Baudry at Ghent University. And it is an example of this thing that is increasingly sort of bothering me, and apparently Steve as well, about the skeptic community just very quickly said, no, I got the answer to that one, and it's a so-and-so fallacy.
Have you seen the pages? There have been a bunch of examples of this. Someone creating a website with like a separate page for each fallacy, with separate links you can send them to people, like, in an argument on some forum thread, you can just say like, oh, this is, like, click here, and then they click here, and it says, like, you've just committed the ad hominem fallacy.
Right, but the argument...
Therefore I win,
Therefore I win. The argument that Martin and I are making in that paper, and then I'll be making in the book with Steve, is that actually, first of all, you need to make a distinction between formal and informal fallacies. The formal fallacies, which belong to standard deductive logic, really are fallacies. If you use modus ponens or modus tollens incorrectly, which are the standard methods of reasoning in deductive logic, you really are committing a fallacy, and there is nothing you can do about it. The problem is with the so-called informal fallacies. The informal fallacies are really about inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning is, by nature, probabilistic. It's not like deductive. It's not like a mathematical proof. So, which means that, in fact, you can turn the thing around, and actually, for every single one of the so-called informal fallacies, you can say, well, depending on the situation, in some cases, that is definitely bad reasoning. In other cases, it's a good heuristic to proceed in a first attempt to whatever the problem is. The classical one, for instance, is the argument from authority.
Right.
Oh, you're arguing from authority, but you're just saying that I should trust Professor Pigliucci because he's an evolutionary biologist. Well, no, but what I'm saying is Professor Pigliucci is in fact an evolutionary biologist, and so other things being equal, what he's saying about evolution is more likely to be correct than your dentist or whoever you're comparing it to. So if you put it that way, that's actually a shortcut. We owe employ the argument from authority at some point or another, because you just can't. I mean, do you believe in quantum mechanics? I mean, I do, but I don't do the experiments. I barely understand what the hell they're doing.
I think a lot of these cases come down to the real world is probabilistic and logic is deterministic. Yeah. And, you know, it's
like
true that
classical
classical logic, yeah. Being a professor of evolutionary biology does not necessarily entail that you are right in this case, but all else equal, it should make someone more likely to, you know, be more likely to be correct.
Say it's a good bet. If you want to bet your money, you probably want to put it that way initially. And then, unless you have good reasons to, you know, go other way. Yeah. Before we go ahead, by the way, I need to clarify for the audience, I'm not the only one drinking beer here. This is an Italian beverage, Chinotto, that our producer Benny Pollack always gets for our taping, and this is a live taping, and I got my Chinotto. So there.
Feeling disapproving stares coming from the Facebook
Yeah, I know. It's like, wait a minute.
The
they have water, and this guy has something that's murky colors, and it's like, okay, sorry.
Now that important matters have been cleared up.
Exactly. Now back to HMO. GMO.
Just to expand what you guys were talking about. Yeah, like a robust consensus of the scientific community, that's not an argument from authority to say that maybe we should have a good reason before we reject that. Exactly. And yeah, the informal logical fallacies, they require judgment and context, and they're not just absolute. Like, you can't just tag somebody with a logical fallacy and they're wrong. Like if I point out that somebody's been convicted of fraud previously, is that an ad hominem logical fallacy? Am I poisoning the well?
Right.
Is that helpful information to putting their claims into context? What I find now is that a lot of pseudoscientists have keyed into our logical fallacy, accusations, and they're turning it all around. They're actually giving a great example of how you can abuse logical fallacies by, like when we say, oh, there's a consensus on global warming, that's an argument from authority logical fallacy. No, it isn't. It's a scientific
consensus.
First
they came for the science words like energy,
yeah,
and now they're coming for our logic words.
They're playing at being skeptics. It's pseudo-skepticism. They're trying to use our own language and approach against us, but of course they're twisting everything to an a priority or predetermined goal. So it is like pseudoscience. You're going through the motions of doing science, but you're not doing it right because you know what the goal is at the end. And it's not the truth, it's the answer you want to get. It's the same thing. They're using the language of skeptics, but not to really have a reliable argument, but just to defend their true belief. But it's amazing how much they could mimic the form of skepticism, even though they're getting the substance wrong.
Sure. And before we leave that particular topic, there is another example that I like to warn people against, and that's the idea of playing with the burden of proof.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you hear very often, initially from skeptics, and now of course from the pseudoscience crowd. Oh, well, that's you're making the positive claim, so you have the burden of proof. As it turns out, I also wrote a paper with Martin about this. Burden of proof is actually context dependent, and there's a large literature. This is not a recent discovery. There's a large literature, mostly in the legal profession, because burden of proof is used all the time in legal cases, of course. And there are legitimate cases where indeed you can make an argument, but in fact you have to make the argument that the burden of proof is on the other side. But simply to say, oh, you're making a positive claim, therefore you have the burden of proof. The people that reason like that obviously don't know elementary logic, because in logic any particular claim P can be turned into the opposite claim by simply putting a not in front of it, and vice versa. So the fact you're making a positive claim, you can just add a not to it and becomes a negative claim, and now all of a sudden by magic I don't have a burden of proof. I don't think so. It's not that easy. It depends. But people don't, including skeptics apparently, or a number of skeptics, don't want to hear the words "it depends." It sounds like, now I have to do work.
That sounds like work.
Yeah.
Sorry, actually, before we go on, it's funny, we've been talking just about fallacies and how they're usually not as simple as they seem to the person making you're committing a fallacy accusation. But this is also something I've noticed with cognitive biases. My organization studies cognitive biases and tries to come up with debiasing techniques and test them out and teach them to people. And I just keep encountering instances where something looks cleanly like an example of, say, the sunk cost bias, in which someone has read half of a book and they realize they're not enjoying it, they're not getting anything out of it, but they force themselves to finish the book because otherwise that 4 hours they've already spent will have been wasted. Well, it's already wasted whether you finish the book or not. So you just, you're supposed to decide which path is best for you going forward.
Save yourself the next 4 hours of boredom. Yeah.
Right. And so that does make sense. And I've made this argument to people before, not necessarily with books, but with things like PhD programs. But often there's a good heuristic behind the seeming bias. Like I might not make this argument in the case of PhD programs, but returning to the book example, you might argue, well, if I have a policy for myself that I have to finish what I've started, even if locally I'm worse off, then maybe I'm just going to be more careful about what I start in the future. Or if you force yourself to finish the sandwich that you're not enjoying just because you already spent the money on it, then maybe you're not going to waste as much money in the future. You're going to think more carefully about whether you actually want that sandwich.
I think
I'm coming up with stupid examples, but hopefully you know what I mean. That this general heuristic, there's often some method to the madness.
I actually have an example of that where I had to think very hard, and it was about a book. This was a science fiction novel about one of those 1,000 plus pages things. This was given to me by a good friend whose taste I trust. And I got to page 200 and I said, oh gosh, I can't make this through the next 800 pages. And so I actually dropped it. And then I thought, I really trust this guy. Let me give it a second try. It did pick up after page 300. And the next 700 pages were worth it. But sometimes you just have to look at the content. Why am I doing this? Not only what have I invested, but what kind of information, background information do I have? Does everybody, is there a lot of good positive reviews about this? Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I should invest more money, more time into the thing. Sometimes no.
Yeah, and I think the bigger picture here in terms of the take home for skeptics is that this is hard work. There's nothing easy about this, about trying to be a critical thinker and examining your own thoughts. And I think the trap that people can fall into, and we all do it to some extent, is to think, okay, I understand logical fallacies, therefore I'm a critical thinker. I understand cognitive biases, therefore I'm not susceptible to them. But you're never there. You're never, ever there. It is just an endless journey of getting better and better and better at deconstructing your own thought process, examining your own biases, getting more and more sophisticated in your ability to think about complicated issues. You're never quite there. We were just chatting before the show about the fact that 10 years ago, I look back at myself 10 years ago, and there were a lot of things I didn't know back then. I still managed to somehow be basically skeptical, but I have much more explanatory tools now than I did back then. Like p-hacking was an example we brought up. I really have a much deeper understanding of the ways in which scientific studies can be manipulated innocently or sometimes not so innocently. So that how did I get away without it 10 years ago or 15 years ago? So I think just don't ever fall for the delusion that you're there, that you are immune to biases or logical fallacies, or your critical thinking is perfect because you understand it, because it's always more complicated than you think. You're just always getting just to more and more deeper and more sophisticated levels, but you're never going to actually be there.
And it occurred to me that I think I know who we can blame for this thing. Carl Sagan and Michael Shermer. The reason I'm saying this in jest in part, but in fact, if you think about it, most of us, at least certainly that is the case for me, one of the earliest books that you read about about skepticism was The Demon Hunted World, which famously had this essay about the baloney
detection kit,
which then Michael made very famous afterwards, and then now, of course, Skeptical Inquirer has its own version, and so on and so forth. And the problem with that kind of approach, which of course you can see why these people have done that, okay, you guys, we should learn about fallacies and so on and so forth. But once you put it in terms of, here's a little set of rules by which you can judge whether something is sound or unsound, then all of a sudden you think that, I got it, that's good, check, and done. It is bullshit or it's not bullshit. And it's more complicated, so I think it's all Carl Sagan's fault. Anyway.
I think it can also sometimes backfire to have that toolkit and labels, for mistakes that you can use to point out other people's mistakes and thereby dismiss their entire argument. It might make you better off if you apply it equally to your own arguments as you do to other people's, and approach it with a general spirit of seeking the truth, as opposed to trying to find the first good excuse you can find to dismiss an argument. But if you don't get through that uncanny valley of critical thinking skill over to the other side, where you're actually a better critical thinker, you can just end up in this pit where any argument that challenges anything you can believe, you go through your list of fallacies or biases and just find one. And if all else fails, you can just say, well, motivated reasoning. Like, you want to believe that's true, and therefore you're biased, and I don't have to listen to you. Like,
right.
check, done.
Right.
It's depressing. I see this a lot.
Steve, back to food. What about, forget the GMOs for a second. You heard this stuff about the food babe recently. What the heck is going on there?
So yeah, I've recently added her to my list.
Right.
Right.
I
have a list
in blood.
of people that I have to pay attention to and frequently counter their arguments. So she's an internet, self-appointed expert who decided that she was going to expose any corporate malfeasance in terms of the food that's out there. Okay. So her formula, and a lot of people have correctly perceived, I think, and deconstructed her formula, is she'll look at anything that's out there, like Subway sandwiches, with the bread in Subway sandwiches, which I think was the one that kind of pushed her in terms of getting attention, and most recently the pumpkin spice latte at Starbucks. She looks at the ingredients for anything that sounds icky, and so if she has trouble pronouncing it, well, you shouldn't be eating it. That's
clearly
that is her heuristic. If you can't pronounce it, it's not food. Then also she likes to stigmatize anything that she can call a chemical, right? And so even though we're all made of chemicals, all food is chemical. I actually one of the memes we made for our Facebook page was all the chemicals in a banana.
Yep.
Bananas are, although they're the product of a lot of cultivation, the old-fashioned genetic engineering, people think, banana, it's pretty natural, but it's loaded with chemicals, So it's chemophobia. It's a naivete about what chemicals are, that everything is chemicals. And then she will just fearmonger about the unnatural chemicals in whatever is currently in her target. And then she tries to marshal her internet army of followers to then publicly embarrass the company. It's really kind of a food terrorism approach. It's like she strong arms them into removing perfectly safe and reasonable ingredients, from their products because she's making it, uncomfortable for them. She's going to harm their business, and it becomes a pathway of least resistance just to cater to what she's saying.
Wouldn't it be simpler and cheaper for them to just rename their ingredients with shorter, easier to pronounce words?
come up with common names for the ingredient. So, and she's completely scientifically illiterate, and also just makes funny mistakes. The most recent thing she did was, again, criticize Starbucks because their pumpkin spice latte has no pumpkin in it. But of course, it's pumpkin spice. It's the spices that go. Never made the claim.
Pumpkin.
There's no pumpkin. That was just silly. But then she said, there's antifreeze in these cookies because the chemical names sound similar, but she completely confuses the chemical names. So typical of what the anti-vaccinationists do. Very, very similar. So. Basically just scientifically illiterate, self-appointed internet expert who is, just making a living, terrorizing perfectly...
But see, that to me is the interesting issue, because the fact that there's yet another nutcase who can't pronounce names and thinks the chemicals are harmful, it's, not surprising. What is, I guess shouldn't be, but I still think is surprising for me, is in fact that these people do have that kind of large following, that they do have an army, as you put it, of people who say, oh yeah, that's right, I can't pronounce that, therefore it must be lethal.
Yeah, this is the dark underbelly of the internet, of social media, and essentially it's replacing mob rule for science-based regulations. It's like, scientists have actually looked at the evidence for azotocarbonamide, for example, in Subway bread or whatever, and lots of different breads have it, not just Subway. And it's perfectly safe. It's the amounts that are in any product you might eat are orders of magnitude below what could possibly cause any harm. But she wants to supplant her own, again, scientifically illiterate opinions and the mob rule of her followers for a process, a science-based regulatory process. And that is not in the public's best interest. It's basically mob rule, and it's terrible.
I think that part of the traction, I suspect, it would be nice to have some sociological study about this, but part of the traction that these people do get is because there is a lot of mistrust about regulatory agencies and the big this or big that, big pharma, big food, and so on and so forth. And frankly, there is good reasons for being distrustful to some extent of large corporations and how they advertise and manipulate the environment, including the regulatory environment.
Sure.
So there is good reasons for that, but that's not the same as saying, oh well, there's a problem with FDA approval, therefore I'm going to go and do my own thing. And decree out of nowhere whether it's something is safe.
Yeah, that's again, there's complexity there. It's really complicated. Like I hate being in a position where I could be perceived as defending the pharmaceutical industry, because the pharmaceutical industry...
Especially if you don't get any money.
Yeah, first of all, I'm not getting paid. But also, I mean, they do a lot of really squirrely and sometimes really just illegal things, or they are pushing the envelope of regulation, or they just do things which are intellectually dishonest, really disgusting in some cases, and they need to get their wrists slapped by regulation. They need to be exposed, like, nope, they shouldn't have done this, this was wrong. And the hammer needs to come down on them hard. But what's interesting is that most of the things you read about quote unquote big pharma are not the things they're actually doing. It's all the made up fake stuff. It's like when you ask people about GMOs, if you want to get back to that, what's your problem with Monsanto? The list of things that they come up with are all wrong. They're all things that have never happened. They're fictitious. I've yet to have somebody actually, when I challenge them, like in an informal setting, so what is it? Why do you think Monsanto's evil? It's like, well, they sue farmers for accidental contamination. Nope, that's not true. They put out Terminator seeds that are sterile. Nope, that's not true. Never put it on the market. Whatever, they come up with a list of things that are just not true. But what's really unfortunate about that is, but the biotech industry shouldn't have a free pass to promote their agenda. We do need to have a meaningful conversation about the limits of patenting, seeds or patenting life, if you will, and what the positives versus negatives of that are. And we need to have a conversation about the rights of farmers versus the rights of corporations, and is monoculture really the way to go, or do we need to, how do we balance all these various interests of consumer, farmer, government, industry? But it all gets whitewashed by big agro is evil, and then all the examples are wrong. They're just fictitious mythology.
Another, speculative thought. Maybe it's Monsanto that is putting out all these pseudoscience.
Well, that's
to avoid the conversation.
You joke, but that's out there. That's the false flag approach, right? Then you say that's like any conspiracy theorist. Well, but this accusation against big pharma or against vaccines or against Monsanto are not true. It's like, oh, well, they created that as a false flag operation in order to undercut their critics. It's like they don't need to undercut their critics. Their critics are doing that all by themselves.
I had a friend of a friend who was kind of a professional, a troll for good, if you will. And he spent, I don't know, at least a couple weeks hanging out with the 9/11 truther crowd, saying that he was making a documentary about how the 9/11 truther movement was created by the government to draw attention away from the actual conspiracy.
Yeah.
And he kept wanting to interview them. They're like, no, there isn't. We're not part of a conspiracy. They're the conspiracy. And he was like, that's exactly what you would say. Good job. It drove him crazy.
Right. Okay, we got a few more minutes, and I don't want to do too much self-promotion.
Maybe we should talk
about our book.
Yeah. Sure.
Also, because promotion is a little early, since the book is about half a chapter, or two half chapters.
2 half chapters,
So can I ask for just a general background question? Is this book more of a spreading the fundamentals of skeptical inquiry to a larger audience, or is it more like addressed towards people who would consider themselves skeptics now, but your point is like, there's some things you're missing or some things you're getting wrong, and we're gonna try to address it, or none of the above?
Yes.
Oh.
So this is an ongoing conversation that Massimo and I are having about the options range from, at one end of the spectrum, a textbook, a dry professional textbook meant to be used in the classroom, versus a book that is meant to popularize scientific skepticism or skeptical thinking. And we've decided that we're going to basically write a textbook, but that is going to be accessible enough that it could also serve as an outreach primer for just somebody to read through. I don't know if we're going to accomplish that goal, But that's I think
I
is
call
our
it
goal.
a text and book.
Text.
Yeah, right, I'm sure. No, but the idea is, in fact, that there's a lot of critical thinking textbooks actually out there, and some of them are actually very good. And I've used some of them in my own classes. The problem with those textbooks is, first of all, most of them actually are too strictly of a textbook, so that they're not accessible really to audiences, to a broader audience, which we would like to have access to. But the other thing is that they tend to fall into two major categories, and either the majority of them are written by philosophers or people who deal with formal, informal logic, that sort of stuff, and so they tend to be about logic, reasoning, and so on. And then there's a smaller number who is written by psychologists or education people, and those tend to be more about cognitive biases and that sort of thing. And we figured, well, why not both? And why not both done using a constant underlying theme, which in this case is going to be the science pseudoscience, discussion. And so the idea is, with the complementarity of Steve's background and mine, we should be able, we hope, to pull off this thing where we do cover all the basic stuff about critical thinking that you do see in textbooks, but we do it in a more captivating and sort of more overarching, interestingly way, so that it can be also used as a book for the general public.
And why? What is scientific skepticism? Like, what do you mean by that term? It's different from regular skepticism.
Yeah, that's the provisional, the
working
title, the working title, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, but to be honest with you, and I'm still trying to figure out who coined the term. I know that Carl Sagan used the term scientific skepticism, but I don't know if he invented it. But essentially, it tries to encapsulate all of the things that we do. It's philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and science, sort of all towards the end of. And I've written about what I think scientific skepticism is on my blog, because it's actually, again, a complicated question. But it's the word skepticism itself could be just philosophical. So this is to say it's more than just the skepticism, the philosophy. It's more than just I don't believe in stuff. It's more than just a generally skeptical attitude. It includes all of those things. It includes understanding of the philosophy of science, of logical fallacies, of heuristics, an understanding of neuropsychological humility. We have to question our own thought processes, our own memories, our own perceptions, and it combines that with a basic scientific literacy and in how all of those things interact and work together, so that you can get to, at the end, use all of those tools to arrive at an opinion about some empirical question that's more likely to be true than just to reflect your own biases.
Yeah, my favorite example of an early scientific skeptic, although the term certainly didn't exist at that time, is David Hume, who famously said that a wise person proportions his beliefs to the evidence. And his approach, even though we think of him as a philosopher, his approach was very much empirical. I mean, he was an empiricist. He was one of the British empiricists. And he thought that, you can talk and speculate all you want, but you really need to look at the data and you need to look at the facts. Right. Before you proceed. And in fact, he was the one famously that came up with that phrase that I just mentioned, is the one that actually eventually inspired Sagan with his famous, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's where it comes from originally. So that's the basic idea, that is, as Steve was saying, a balancing and harmonious mixing, I would say, of science and philosophy, so critical thinking and evidence-based assessment of claims.
In fact, I think our original concept was it was going to be science, psychology, and philosophy, and we actually asked a psychologist to join us and be a trio, but they were too busy. So we're going to divide up, I guess, the psychology part between the two of us. But yeah, so that.
Any psychologists out there?
Yeah. That was the concept of bringing those three elements together from three different perspectives and have it all merge. But yeah, we'll make it work out.
One of the things I'm most excited about around this idea, which hopefully is warranted, is that, so a friend of mine wrote a blog post a while back called "The Cowpox of Doubt," and he was referring to the frequent focus in the world of skepticism on arguments and claims that are just clearly, to the people paying attention, bad arguments and clearly absurd claims. And the fact that these examples of paranormal claims are so often used as the poster children for, people have wrong beliefs is kind of, he said, like a vaccination against doubting yourself. Because what happens is you look at these claims and these arguments that are just so obviously bad, and you're like, well, that's what a wrong belief looks like. It looks clearly absurd, and you look at your own beliefs and you're like, none of these look clearly absurd. And
Especially
so you
not to me.
Right, exactly. And so, having that association with wrong beliefs as things that are just clearly absurd sort of inoculates you against believing that you could actually be wrong. And so what I'm hoping is that your book will drive home to people that wrong beliefs feel just like right beliefs to you. So you need to actually dig deeper.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I've written. I didn't use that metaphor, but I've written about that as well. That because we often get asked, well, why are you bothering to once again debunk UFOs? Everybody knows they're silly or Bigfoot or whatever. And so I always, when I write about those sort of extreme wrong beliefs, to try to connect it to things people actually believe, not just the fringe. And the metaphor I have used is that this is like the end stage of a disease. Right, so when we show, like when somebody comes into the hospital and they have a really advanced disease, you call over all the medical students. You're never going to see something this bad again in your career. Look how advanced this is. With trying to be more sensitive to the patient, but
that would not be very good.
We hide it in technical terms. We talk in front of the patient in a way that they can't understand. What we're really saying is, oh my God, can you imagine how advanced this is?
I'm paranoid about every technical term my doctor uses.
So,
describe me.
But the reason you want to see it is because you can wrap your head around the pathology. But the goal is to be able to recognize subtle forms. You want to recognize the early subtle form of the disease, because now you really understand how the pathology works, because you've seen it in a more blatant, extreme, end-stage version. So I try to make that metaphor. So when I show you these logical fallacies and these bad reasoning and motivated reasoning and these extreme believers, I want you to derive the general rules that you then will apply to yourself in all of the very subtle forms that we every day do. So I always often point that out. We all do this every day. This is just an extreme example. But we all anomaly hunt. We all engage in confirmation bias. And you have to recognize the more subtle forms of it, because otherwise you end up thinking that, so as long as I don't believe in really weird things, I'm okay, but it's not true. Yeah.
Shall we go to the Q&A? So
sure.
Maybe it's time to wrap up the first part of the podcast.
All right. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. And we are all out of time for this part of the podcast, so we are going to wrap things up, and instead of moving on to the Rationally Speaking picks, we're going to take advantage of this lovely live studio audience and turn it over to them for some Q&A. So, Mike, I think we'll go around with a mic.
Absolutely.
Great.
Ooh, I can
and
see
we should repeat the question back in case,
Oh, and feel free to direct the questions.
I was just operating on faith all this time.
Right. Feel free to direct the questions to any of the three of us. Of course, mostly to Steve, because he's our guest. But, it's not like Julie and I don't have anything to say about things. Do we? Maybe.
Thoughts rattling.
Tell me where to go. Oh, so that's why I can see you now, right? Over there. Yes, sure.
Just wanted to make Mike run.
Thank you. In college, I took a couple courses in the history of science, and we learned, kind of used as a way of interpreting everything. T.S. Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts and such. And I guess I'd be interested in your opinions about considering that once people are adults, they've learned in certain ways how to deal with scientific claims and so on, and they may be stubborn, that if they, when young, like in grade school, the textbooks didn't say this is how it is, but this is something like, this is the current consensus amongst professional scientists, it's the prevailing paradigm. Maybe young people would be more motivated or have more permission to change things.
Okay, so the question is about, would it help to do more history of science, to expose young students to more history of science concepts like Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shifts and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, so I agree that science education is terrible in this country, and I know there are great science teachers out there doing a great job, but unfortunately, it's not. I don't think it's the rule. I think it may be more the exception. I have 2 daughters now going through public school, and I'm paying very close attention to their science education. And this is, I live in Connecticut. It's a pretty affluent part of the country. We have a above average educational system in the state and in our area, and yet the science education is really disappointing. It's my older daughter, who is a curious, very bright girl, is like, oh, she's actually getting turned off from science because of the way it's being taught is just not interesting at all to her, which is just sad to see. I do agree. So like a lot of times they will be given experiments to do, which are more about going through the superficial motions, and they're not learning what they're supposed to be learning from doing an experiment, like how to think about variables and control, and you know what I mean? They're not really thinking their way through the experiment. It's not an endeavor of exploration. It's just you have to go through the motions and get the result you're supposed to get. I do agree. I think that when I have wrapped my head around a complex scientific concept the best, it's because it was when it was explained or taught to me in a way where it's like, this is the history of this concept. Because generally speaking, an individual will go through the same process of trying to understand something that historically the scientific community has gone through. It's like, first, this is the first thing that occurred to them, but then that turned out to be wrong. So then they tried to think about it this way, and as our individual understanding, I think, recapitulates the scientific community's historical understanding, and that turns out to be a great way to explain the process of science, the logic of science, and where we currently are with the findings of science all at once. And I wish that schools did that, but I don't see a lot of that happening.
So this is the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny model of science education. I want to make a comment about that. I think that there is a distinction between different types of science literacy. And there's science literacy. People mean different things by it. Do you know enough facts about science? Have you done these kind of sort of perfunctory experiments, which are really demonstrations about things, or do you actually understand something about the nature of science? And of course, to some extent, you need all of them. I mean, you do want people to get kids to have some kind of hands-on sense of what it means to do a scientific experiment. You do want certainly to them to know the basic facts about certain sciences, especially the so-called special sciences, which is everything other than physics, where if you don't have the facts, if you don't have a basic amount of facts, you just can't think. But at the same time, what is often missing, and this is not just at the pre-college level, but even at the college level, is in fact a good understanding of the nature of science, which I agree, historically, the historical approach tends to be the best. The problem is that history has its own baggage. I mean, often it is itself explained, presented as, the most boring thing in the whole universe. It can be made interesting. There are very good examples out there of curricula that do that, but it's a difficult balance. Julia.
Yes, so you will appreciate this, given you're interested in the structure of scientific revolutions. In a previous podcast, actually, a few episodes ago, I mentioned this thing that I've been doing that I call a surprise journal, where I've been paying attention to little things that surprise or confuse me, things that I either wasn't expecting or if I'd thought about it, wouldn't have been expecting. Maybe even things as small as someone agreeing with me when I didn't expect they would, or disagreeing with me when I didn't expect they would, or enjoying some event more than I thought I would, that sort of thing. And I got the idea for that from Thomas Kuhn's discussion of anomalies as sort of surprises, things that don't fit the current reigning model of physics or astronomy, and that require some sort of explanation, and that signal to you that something about your model of the world is wrong, or is maybe more too confident than it should be. And so these surprises are signs that you got something other than what you were expecting, even if you didn't know you were expecting anything at all, which is a quote actually from a psychologist named Dan Gilbert. That's how he talks about surprise in Stumbling on Happiness. Also tying this into science education, I mentioned this on the podcast, and I got a letter few weeks later from a high school science teacher from beyond the grave. Explain that, skeptics.
That would have been impressive. Yes.
No, still fun though. A high school science teacher who liked the idea of the surprise journal when he heard it on the podcast and instituted it as a semester-long project for his students.
Oh, wow.
So over the course of the semester, they have to record at least, I don't remember, 15, 20 surprises that they noticed and write down like, why did this surprise me? What does it say about me or my beliefs that this surprised me? And so they haven't turned in their project yet, so he doesn't know what they've all recorded. But what he said he has noticed, and what got him excited enough to write to me, was that his typical problem in class was to get students to believe that they could be wrong about anything. I mean, it's a common human problem, but these are like 15-year-olds, so it's worse. And he suspects this is because they think it's bad to be wrong. You know, you get points off on tests when you're wrong. But now, he said he keeps noticing again and again, students will make a mistake and then they'll go, oh, wow, that's a surprise, and then write it down, in their journal. So it's actually, they're like kind of, it's fun now to notice surprises.
How many times can I be wrong? Yeah.
It's like reframes the entire process of noticing mistakes as a sort of,
nice.
fun game or process of discovery.
Next question. Yes, over there, Michael.
Yes,
Hold on a second. We need the mic. Both as in Michael and in the microphone.
I'm a professor. I'm used to talking to others.
Yeah, but we're taping, so we still need the mic.
Okay. It's very, very simple. That throughout the world society, and particularly in much of the United States, it's the difference between being trained to believe and being trained to think. And this is bound up, of course, with religion. All the world's religions, this is the word. And the trouble is, advertising in the United States, the same thing. Why does advertising work? Because anybody, the average person, reads an ad and believes it.
Okay?
How can we teach critical thinking?
All right, so let me rephrase the question, and then I'll open into the panel, so to speak. So the idea is, of course, that there's a tension between being trained to believe things and being trained to critically assess things. And there's many aspects to it, the role of religion, the role of advertising, as you pointed out. And then the basic question is, how can you reverse the trend and teach critical thinking, other, of course, than buying the book that Steve and I are about to write. So, Steve, how do we teach critical thinking?
Well, I don't think there's any one way. I think there's got to be a cultural change. I do agree that in our culture, belief and faith are looked upon as virtues, and doubt and skepticism is looked upon as a vice. People are always denigrating skeptics, as if that's, and then in a lot of popular fiction, the skeptic is the villain, or at least the person that is lacking in some way, and it's the person who has the belief and the faith who's going to ultimately,
think X-Files.
Yeah, X-Files, exactly. It's the same thing. But that formula is played over and over and over again. So, I like fiction where the hero is a scientist, but even then there's a tendency to make the process magical. So it's so, like the scientist is so brilliant that he just knows the answer just out of sheer brilliance, and there's no process involved. Very few shows have shown the dirty, critical thinking, hard, intellectual, often wrong, probing kind of critical thinking process of coming up with an answer. It's either this magical super genius, or you just got to have faith, neither of which are very, I think, productive.
One of the things that I'd like to have students read is actually the original Sherlock Holmes, because in the original, in canon, Conan Doyle, not often, but it does happen that Holmes is wrong, or Holmes doesn't solve a case. There are a few of the short stories that end up with, he says, well, I don't know, I just don't have enough, I don't have enough to go. And that is, the first time I reread actually the whole Sherlock Holmes canon recently, a couple of years ago, because I was writing an essay for one of these philosophy and pop culture books on Holmes. And it surprised me because I hadn't read it in many, many years. And when I got to the first story that ends like that, I said, really? I don't remember Holmes being wrong. But that's because most of the images of Holmes that we have are actually from the TV shows or the movies, where in fact he's never wrong and he always finds the culprit. In the original, it's much more interesting, it's much more nuanced. If you follow the Sherlock Holmes stories, you'll see that even though he claims to have a method, often he says, you know, Watson, this is my method, you know, I have a method. But in fact, if you pay attention, the method is really whatever works. It's like, okay, this time I'm going to try this one, this time that one that isn't working, so I'm going to try something else. And actually, it's a great reference point for, and it's fun to read. Even still today. So I would say that's one way to approach critical thinking in a more fun way.
Yeah, it's a very clinical approach, actually, from Holmes. And of course, you know, Doyle, you know, was a physician, so you can recognize that, yeah, to use whatever works, you know, at the time, and in a lot of different kind of intellectual approaches, not strictly deductive or inductive. It's Holmesian, you know, logic. And I agree. Like if you look at more modern portrayals, and Sherlock Holmes. Like characters like Columbo, they know the answer in the first act. They know the answer immediately because they're just that brilliant, and the rest is just a show. Right. The rest is just a show to backfill what they figured out right away, rather than they're genuinely befuddled and have to find their way through, which would be a much more interesting, I think, an illustrative way to approach it.
Well, I'm not going to tackle the teaching of critical thinking since the two of you did that eloquently. But neither of you touched on the initial premise of the question, which was that advertisements train children to believe rather than to think, which right. I'm not sure I believe that. I think that advertisements used to be more explicitly about making claims about the product and what it will do for you. Like if you look at old ads, they're hilarious. They're just like long paragraphs of text with claims about the product and, you know, a smiling housewife or something. And I think people have actually just gotten more cynical about advertising over the decades, which is why advertisers have had to turn to more sort of abstract, entertaining ads with fewer words and fewer explicit claims that just have sort of try to create a sense of familiarity with the product and a sort of vague halo affect where the product just feels cool or feels like, you know, edgy or something like that. And I don't quite know what that shift is going to do or is doing to the, you know, potential critical thinking faculties of our youth, whether that's good or bad. It's certainly sort of harder to refute a claim that hasn't been made explicitly.
Before going to the next question, that reminded me for some reason of a recent article that I read in, I think it was the New York Times, about an obvious case where there can be such a thing as too much skepticism. Because I think that skepticism or critical thinking is actually somewhere along a curve, and the ideal is somewhere in the middle. Well, maybe not in the middle, but definitely not an extreme, meaning that too much skepticism can actually lead to nihilism and to the upper rejection. Right, paralysis. Yeah. And the case in point of this essay in the New York Times was the attitude that current Russians have about anything that they hear. They are incredibly skeptical. They reject anything because they've, you know, for more than a generation, for 2 generations, they lived in a place where you simply couldn't trust anything that was printed in the media or came out of the government. So now they say, well, whatever, it must be another conspiracy because it used to be, you know, it was a conspiracy in the past, it was a conspiracy for 70 years, so why should it be different now? And that leads to paralysis because that does mean that they're not discriminating the good information from the bad information. They're not acting on that discrimination because for them it's all baloney and it all needs to be rejected or taken, you know, in stride. So the next question, yes, all the way up there, Mike.
My question is
wait, hold on a second. Sorry, we're taping, so we need the mic.
It's a question and also proposal. Maybe you will consider it.
Okay.
What about, I'm a family therapist, so I'm a systemic thinker, and when I see children growing up in a very strict religious environment and going to a religious school and become adult, that could be a subject to do research as an adult, as well as comparing them with individuals who are growing up in a very secular environment and also going to a secular school and becoming an adult, and compare the outcome, how they're good critical thinker in the real life situations, like a comparative study.
Yeah, so the issue is, can we do, or has it been done actually, a comparative study about the critical thinking abilities of people who grow up in very different cultural backgrounds, such as, let's say, a fundamentalist religion, and a completely secular area. So, Steve, do you know of any studies of that type?
Not exactly like that. I mean, there's lots of studies looking at the attitudes and, you know, intelligence sometimes, or the tendency to believe advertisements. Because there are studies where they look at people who espouse religious beliefs and people who are self-identified agnostics or atheists or non-believers, to see like who is more critical thinking, who's more likely to perceive pareidolia. I mean, all these things have been done, and there aren't dramatic differences, and sometimes the differences are not consistent. You know, so I think that the research is early, and there's some intriguing early results, like, oh, people who have a religious background are more likely to see the face in the cloud or whatever. You know what I mean? So things like that. They're more likely to go along with authority. They're more likely, you know, so. I don't know that we have enough of a data set yet to make any kind of clear statements about what the effect of the upbringing was. And it's also hard to tease that apart from the genetics, because that tends to also go along with
there are
the upbringing.
some interesting studies in the political sciences about, you know, sort of how much can people with a declared affiliation to a particular party sort of rationalize information that is clearly wrong. So you can, for instance, expose people to an actual speech by a politician where he actually says X, and they thought it didn't say X. So, well, why do you think it said X? And the interesting thing that comes out of these studies, and this cuts across the political spectrum, both right and left, seems like people with a loose political affiliation but low levels of education will tend to rationalize. People with an intermediate degree of sort of attachment to the political party, but with a good degree of education, will actually see through the thing and say, oh, okay, I guess it, you know, that was actually wrong about this. And then at the opposite extreme, people who are very intelligent and very committed will almost never change their mind, even though they're presented with the evidence that clearly they're wrong about whatever the specifics was. Because the reasoning there is apparently they're not only very ideologically committed, but they're also very intelligent, so they can come up with all sorts of very smart ways of rationalizing what they're hearing, which is perhaps not surprising, but disturbing.
Yeah, the intelligence actually doesn't predict whether you're going to stick to your guns or bend to the evidence. It's the passion with which you hold
right.
the ideological position.
It's how much you're invested emotionally.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, like Steve, I'm also concerned about confounding factors in these comparative studies. So I've said it before, I'll say it again. Clearly the answer here is to kidnap 1,000 babies and have 500 of them raised by actor parents who are raising them religious and 500 raised by actor parents who are raising them non-religious, and then we can compare. I don't know why my proposals never get past the human subjects boards, but, you know, I'll just keep saying it.
But no, I have an even better idea. I thought that the ideal experiment is to have people have sex with each other in particular and combinations.
Your experiments always involve people having sex.
I know.
I've noticed a pattern.
I know. There was another question back up there, yes.
Yes, so the advertisement here said that you might talk about things that might be off limits to skepticism and skeptical activism. I don't think you've quite covered that yet. So is there anything that you think should be off limits to skepticism or skeptical activism?
Should there be something that is off limit to skepticism or skeptical approaches, analysis? No, I don't think so. I mean, anything. If it seems to me that if anything has any interest whatsoever, practical or theoretical, then it should be open to critical analysis. The issue may be, you know, where you want. We all have a limited amount of energy and you know and resources and time available, and so the issue might be, well, you know, you have to pick your fights. As Steve was saying earlier, you know, it's probably astrology at this point is not exactly at the top of my list, even though I'm completely befuddled by every time that I walk in the village and see how many psychic shops there are there. And, you know, they only charge $10 a session. And if you do the calculations and have any idea of how much it costs them probably to rent that shop, it's like, how many people do these people see? You know, the consultation must last a microsecond for them to be viable. But it's not like I'm not too concerned about that. I am concerned about things like climate change or vaccine denial and that sort of stuff. So I think it's more a matter, in my mind, it's more a matter of picking your fights where both the topic is important because it has consequences, and also where you may be more able to make some leeway. You have to also to be careful about picking stuff there where you say, well, I can actually spend the next few years working on this and something is actually going to happen.
This is actually a very deceptively complicated question. And I'm not sure how deep I want to get into it, but I don't think there's anything that's taboo that we won't address, but I think there's a caution for anyone who wants to be a skeptical activist in that if you take on issues that are politically or ideologically dominated, right? If there is an ideological aspect to what you're promoting, the risk is that you will confuse your own value judgments for objective skeptical analysis or critical thinking analysis. And I do see this happen within the movement, is that you have people at one end of the political spectrum think that approach, that political approach to skepticism is the correct approach, and they kind of mix in their political ideology with the skepticism and critical thinking. Again, I don't tell people what they should or should not do. I don't even give my advice on that. I try to not get into issues of my own political value system, and I consider myself successful if people don't know where I fall on the political spectrum, and I think most people don't, because you shouldn't be able to infer my personal politics from my skeptical activism if I'm doing my job the way I want to do it. I'm not saying that's the way you should do it. I'm just saying that's the way I personally choose to do it. And I certainly, see what I feel are a lot of examples of people who are promoting critical thinking and skepticism, but they're doing it from a very particular ideological point of view, which unnecessarily narrows their audience. And then they eventually get to the point where they're confusing their values with empirical objective claims. And I think that's counterproductive. So that's, I don't know if I made myself perfectly clear, but that's, I think, the closest thing I would get to a subject that I think is where there's a huge pitfall to addressing it from a skeptical point of view.
Julia, what do you think?
Yeah, I was also going to issue a caution about getting into political and social debates. Not to say that you shouldn't do it, but that I consider politics hard mode of skepticism, basically, and that's for a few reasons. Partly, it's because ethical, political, social issues tend to be the most emotionally fraught. It's the hardest to sort of stay calm, stay receptive to other people's arguments, genuinely consider the possibility you might be wrong. In theory, ideally, we would all be able to do that perfectly. We're not. So it's like a very valuable thing to work at, but it's hard mode. And then I think also there's there's multiple levels of possible disagreement, and you have, I think, many more of those layers in political, what I'll just, to use shorthand, call political arguments. There are disagreements over empirical predictions, like beliefs about what will happen if you do such and such. There are disagreements over values, like ethical, moral, or religious values, and there are disagreements that stem from semantics, like you're using words differently. And so if you're in discussions where you're talking about what people should do, which I think picks out a large proportion of what I'm calling political arguments, or what we think societies should do, should is just this very, very laden word. And if people disagree over what you should do, that could be because they have different beliefs about what will happen in society if we raise the minimum wage, or if we change social mores about gender or about marriage or monogamy, or it could be that they have different values, or it could be that you're just using words differently. And the words that we use in political and social discussions also tend to be very fraught and different people have different meanings that they associate with them, and different emotional meanings as well. So it's just so many strands to pull apart, and to do so delicately and precisely and without allowing your emotions to get the better of you. It's hard.
Right, so in this case, I think I'm going to actually strike a chord of disagreement with my two esteemed colleagues. So Aristotle famously said that human beings are the rational animal. He also said that they were the political animal. I think he was exaggerating on the rational side. But we're not that rational, but we're definitely political. And it seems to me that precisely for the reasons that actually Steve and Julia have explained so well, skepticism and critical thinking in issues that are social and political is even more important and ought to be practiced even more, precisely because these are so emotional and so important issues for all of us. The problem is that there are all these issues, all these pitfalls that Steve and Julia pointed out, and that makes it even more complicated. To me, more complicated stuff is more interesting, but I can see why people will want to stay out of it and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do instead. Sometimes, however, it's just not possible to stay out of it. Like, you mentioned climate change.
Yeah.
You can't stay out of politics.
Yeah, but let me clarify, though, what I'm saying, because I do think we need to give examples to illustrate what we're talking about. So climate change is a good example. Like, for example, we can talk about the empirical claims within the issue of climate change without saying, therefore, I personally endorse this particular fix or remedy, right? So let me give you one that I run into a lot, and that's regulation in medicine. So like regulating the pharmaceutical industry, regulating supplements. I write a lot about that regulation, what the regulation that exists and how inadequate it is. And this is where I get as close as I ever come to making political advocacy statements. Like, probably is a good idea if companies had to have some evidence of efficacy and safety before they put a product on the market. But I do then try to caution myself against taking a hard political stance on that issue, because you can still talk about it. I could still say, well, most people think that there are protections for supplements. Most people don't realize that companies can make claims without evidence. Here's, I can explore the logic of structure-function claims and how easy it is to abuse them and circumvent the regulations, et cetera, et cetera. You can talk about the issue in a very descriptive way, address all the empirical claims, without necessarily saying, and therefore this is what we politically should do, or at least if you're going to do that, you have to explicitly acknowledge the values that you are basing your recommendation on. So like with global warming, again, people are going to have a more personal freedom libertarian approach to it versus a more we need the government to regulate away this problem, approach to it. And I think what's important to do as skeptics is to be sort of the politically neutral arbiter of the evidence and the empirical claims and the logic, rather than aligning the critical thinking science with a political value, because then you're actually, first of all, you're giving a reason for half of your audience to dismiss your opinion.
Right.
And I think we should be trying to disconnect empirical claims from value judgments. But the hardest thing to do is to separate it from your own values, especially when they seem so reasonable to you,
Right. Up there, yeah.
Massimo, before the goodbyes, I have a couple of announcements about leaving in the elevator. So
sounds good. We can take a couple more questions, and then we'll do the goodbyes.
Hi. You mentioned wording just now. Related to my work in ecological restoration, there's a lot of effort to bring back species like the American chestnut and the American elm through disease resistant. And what I've noticed is that when you use words like bring back, people get very excited about that. People get very, it's almost like, I don't know how it just strikes a chord with people, but if you said we're creating disease-resistant American chestnut or American elm, people get quite freaked out by it. They don't want to, I think the idea of having chestnuts everywhere on Christmas is amazing, or having poets walk everywhere else in America is a great thing. But so what I'm wondering is how important is that in general, sort of, USA Today released scientific news, how important is wording in terms of if you try to avoid a word like creating, is that just pandering to people who may be afraid of that word? Or
Right.
that's
Yeah, so the question is about the framing, really, of these issues, because you can, the example you brought up was if we claim that we're restoring the American chestnut by, in fact, genetically modifying it to make it resistant to the blight, that's more acceptable than say, we're genetically modifying the thing to make it resistant. So yeah, there's a large literature on framing effect, and it is certainly true that you can change the wording, you can change the point of view, have your audience look at it differently, and you will get, in fact, significantly different responses depending on how you present things. I mean, that is where you go, you pass the line, if there is a clear line between sort of the logic of argumentation on the one hand and sort of the rhetoric on the other, right? The two are actually related. In fact, there's an interesting article in the latest issue of Skeptical Inquirer that talks about the rhetorical use, the use of rhetoric that skeptics can do, because most of the time skeptics make the opposite mistake of saying, I want to stay away from manipulation, rhetoric. I want to just present the facts, and clearly that will win the day, when clearly that doesn't happen. The facts by themselves don't win the day. You do need to, you're engaging with human beings, which means being right, assuming that you're right, it's only part of the story. You also have to convince other people to change their mind or to embrace your point of view, and that, there's no way around it. It is, in fact, a type of manipulation, which hopefully you're doing in the clear, you're doing it the right way. But I don't think there is anything necessarily wrong in creating the most persuasive arguments, as long as you are on solid grounds in terms of facts, and actually I would say on values, when the values become important to the discussion. But what's your take?
Yeah, well, this is the framing debate, right? And what's interesting is that it's a debate, that within the skeptical community, there's a conversation being had about, is framing dirty? Is it somehow unskeptical to think about how you're presenting information? And shouldn't we just present the cold, hard facts and logic and not make any attempt at, portraying them in a certain way or from a certain point of view, versus, well, from a practical point of view, first of all, you are framing, even if you don't think you're doing it, you're doing it. You just may be doing it in an assumed or default way that you're not thinking about, as opposed to thinking about how to craft and present the message. Again, as long as you're not compromising the facts and logic, you can still present it equally in different ways, and some are going to be more socially acceptable or more, you'll maybe avoid some knee-jerk, negative reactions to it. So but it feels anti-skeptical to think consciously about framing. It seems a little bit too much like advertising. And so we have a negative reaction to it, and we suck at it, which is probably related to the fact that we're not good at it because we don't like it. Unfortunately, a lot of our ideological enemies, like the anti-vaccine movement, the food babe, et cetera, they're really good at it, because that's basically all they're doing is framing. They're coming up with slogans that are keying into some kind of real resonating vibe that people have, like green our vaccines. It's perfect, and people get it. They know what it means right away. We don't have the equivalent on our side, because we always, if we did come up with something, and it's like, yeah, but that's not quite right, and we'll sort of deconstruct our own sort of way of framing things, which is all good and healthy, but it's really hard to communicate that to the public. So again, I don't have the magic solution. It's kind of it's a core problem with communicating the idea of intellectual complexity. How do you convey that idea in a way that's not complicated? Well, you can't. So there's some compromise in there. There's some way to make it all happen, but it's really hard. It takes, I think, a lot of thought and talent, and we sort of we know it when we see it. Like Carl Sagan managed to do it fabulously. He had a skill and a talent at doing that we would all love to emulate, but it's just really hard. But I think partly because it kind of rubs us the wrong way, and we sort of undercut our own attempts at doing it.
Yeah, when I see people who are uncomfortable with framing, but have to do it to some extent anyway, it reminds me of a friend of mine when she was just learning how to play pool. She was very nervous about it. She hated that she was so bad at it. And when she took a shot, she would kind of flinch away and shoot like this without really looking. And of course she was terrible. And it just reminds me of these sort of efforts at people making efforts despite themselves at framing. Yeah, I've been more focused. Well, I should note that I had a lot of concerns about any kind of, not just in terms of wording, but any element of an argument a situation in which someone was trying to persuade someone else, in which they were using persuasive tactics that didn't just rely on argument or evidence, until finally I just read study after study after study. For example, the study that showed that when you smile at someone, they're more likely to believe what you say, and the study that showed that if you have coffee with someone, they're more likely to believe what you say. And finally, I was just like, this is a huge spectrum, and there's not a clear ethical and unethical, ethical and unethical buckets. There's not a clear right answer of at what point from smiling at someone to like outright lying, does it become unethical?
Well, talk about the evidence. So within the field of medicine, we're having the same discussion because the naive, just sort of automatic default way that, say, for example, physicians or healthcare providers tried to convince patients that they should engage in more healthful lifestyles was to the scared straight approach. It's like, well, if I tell the patient all the horrible things that will happen to them if they smoke and all the health benefits of not smoking, they'll make the rational decision. But of course, that doesn't work. It's
so cute.
Now it's like hopelessly naive, but it's amazing that's still what people do because that's just the default thing that we do. We explain things rationally to people and think they're going to make a rational decision. So there's a lot of research is being done. Well, how can we communicate the information in a way that's accurate and ethical, but that may be more effective? Essentially, it's a framing argument. So now, like what the technique that's most popular is so-called motivated interviewing, where you ask the patient questions and get them to say what their health goals are. So I guess I want to be more healthy. I want to live longer. And then you say, well, do you think that quitting smoking will accomplish the goals that you just told me that you had? I mean, so it is absolutely manipulative. You're trying to manipulate the person's psychology to get them to do what they want to do anyway and what they should be doing from the perspective of what's healthful for them medically, but you're getting them to sort of trick themselves psychologically into manipulating themselves into doing it. And then even then, it's only a little bit more effective, than just telling them you should stop smoking. You get up from like 5% to 15%. Whoa, that's a huge gain. But it's still like 85% of the time, people are going to do what they're going to do. So the bottom line is it's really hard to get people to change their thinking and behavior with rational arguments. It's more effective to get them to do it through social pressures. But again, that doesn't feel right to us as skeptics. So how do you at least frame the accurate skeptical information in a way that it's at least the social pressures are at least not working against us? Maybe that is something that we could feel comfortable doing, but we still were terrible at it, I think.
This discussion reminds me, and it's closely related to another issue which is common in the skeptic community. I mean, when Steve said earlier on, people try to separate the hard facts from, what you think and the way you present them and so on and so forth. And in fact, there is no such a thing as the hard facts because, and this has been something that has been well known in philosophy of science at least for 40 or 50 years, but in fact even Darwin realized this. He wrote a famous letter to one of his friends where he was frustrated by people who were asking him for the facts separate from the theory, and he says there's no such thing as a fact separate from the theory. The facts are embedded. Something becomes a fact only once you start looking at it in a certain way. In philosophy of science, it's called the theory-lateness of data. You just can't do it. Facts are an infinite number of bits of information. I mean, everything is a fact in this room, but it's not a fact unless you actually look at it in a certain way and for a particular purpose, which means that you're already framing. That just by the very fact you're saying this is a fact and this is not a fact, or this is a relevant fact, this is not a relevant fact, you are already framing the thing in a way that, as Steve said, might feel to you natural and neutral, but in fact it's not, because demonstrably there are other ways of looking at the same collection of bits of information in a quite a different way, which is not an argument for relativism. It's not an argument of, well, then anything goes, you can look at it in an infinite number of ways. No, but there is always more than one way, more than one pertinent way of looking at a particular bit of information. And so presenting it in a certain way actually is not only inevitable and shouldn't be frustrating. It should be something that we are aware of and take advantage for our purposes rather than do without it. We have time for one more question, yes. Michael. I should have maximized Michael's exercise and just picked things on the different aisles.
If we were trying to deductively prove a logical proposition, we would use the set of rules that we've agreed to in advance, one of which is that the premises we're given at the outset are the only pieces of information we may fairly consider. Nothing else is allowed to come in from outside. When people overuse, misuse, whatever, informal fallacies of logic, to what extent is that people trying to apply the same framework, the same way of thinking to situations where it really doesn't apply? The fact that someone has previously been convicted of fraud, when you get right down to it, that doesn't prove that the thing that he's trying to sell me right now is fraudulent. But it is a piece of information from outside that, in this situation, I am allowed to consider. There isn't a rule saying that I may not.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the issue here is basically the difference again between deductive and inductive logic. When in deductive logic, you simply agree to a certain number of premises that are unquestioned at the beginning of the reasoning, and then from those premises, if the reasoning is valid, then you definitely reach certain conclusions. The same does not apply in inductive logic and informal fallacies, because the background information there does very much become relevant, as the example illustrates. Are you going to buy something from somebody who's been convicted before for fraud? Well, that doesn't. It's not a logically mandated conclusion that the person is going to try to swindle you again. On the other hand, you'd be a fool if you completely discarded that information as irrelevant to the case at hand. But I would go even further than that. I would say that even though both in philosophy and in logic there is still a somewhat clear distinction between deductive and inductive logic, in reality there is a blurred boundary there, because unless we're talking about formal logic that has no content, as in, if standard exercise in basic logic, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Okay, that is in fact valid reasoning. But as soon as you start putting something on those, substituting actual things for those P and Q, then the background information does become relevant. And it is in fact the case that every time you apply deductive logic outside of pure logic and mathematics, so that is whenever you try to apply it for actual cases of empirical evidence, well, that information in the premises has to come from somewhere. And usually that information comes either from observation or experiments or other kind of inductive knowledge. And therefore, you're essentially bringing in inductive knowledge right at the beginning of your deductive reasoning, and one can reasonably question that operation to begin with. One can say, in fact, all of those formal structures of inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, should be really looked at as if-then kind of clauses. That is, if the premise is correct, if these are the premises correct, then it will follow. But you can question the premise. Obviously, one of the ways to counter an argument is to question the premise. And if the premise is empirical, it can always be questioned.
Yeah, I think another way to look at this is the problem of ad hoc reasoning, which unfortunately we all do all the time. You can't avoid it. But that means is that you're kind of choosing the way to think about things as you go. And the problem with that, it's sort of, again, the unavoidable problem, is that especially once you start to get all the tools of skepticism, of critical thinking, it just gives you more tools that you can draw on in order to make an argument for whatever it is you want to believe anyway. Right? So that's sort of what we were talking about before, where people can use logical fallacies to argue for their a priori belief or their position. But they're just applying it as needed in order to achieve the goal that they're looking for. So, in other words, every sort of argument that we would bring to bear requires judgment. And I think that's a part that even skeptics feel uncomfortable with, because we want to be able to say, no, this is absolutely either valid or invalid. And it's hard, it's difficult, because when you start to deconstruct it more and more, you realize that at the end of the day, there's just some judgment involved. Why does the precautionary principle tell us that it's probably a reasonable idea to think of ways to pump less CO2 into the atmosphere, but not reasonable to say that we shouldn't be feeding our animals GMO corn? the precautionary principle could apply in either case. So you can't just say, you can't invoke the precautionary principle as an absolute. You have to put it in the context of a lot of details. And that, but at the end of the day, it comes down to a judgment call about how reliable the science is and how robust the research is and how compelling the arguments are. But we all feel, I think, uncomfortable with having it come down to a subjective judgment call at the end of the day, but there's just no way around it.
Before Julia comments on this basically, there's a term for this kind of complex reasoning, which essentially, again, it's what Sherlock Holmes actually used to do. And it's called inference to the best explanation. It technically is a kind of inductive reasoning, but in fact, some philosophers actually think that it's its own category, separate from induction and deduction. Yeah. And the name itself is interesting, inference to the best explanation. The best explanation, not the true explanation.
Right.
Right? The best explanation could be the best you can do given the data, given the information, and given our limited reasoning abilities. It may not be the truth or the ultimate truth. It's just the best that we can do about it. But that's still your best bet at the moment, given the
right.
context. Julia, yeah.
Yeah, so I think this phenomenon that you've pointed at is, I wouldn't be surprised if it's partly due to just a logical confusion in people's minds between inductive and deductive reasoning. But I think that it also stems from our innate tendency to treat arguments as battles, in which,
It's the word argument?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at the language, I don't know if this is true in languages other than English, but it's certainly true in English that the words we use to talk about arguments, like attacking or defending an argument hitting its mark, or even conceding a point is the same word basically as ceding territory. It's fascinating that we just have this intuitive sense that arguments, can be won or lost, just like battles. And so if you're in battle mode, then you don't want to concede that some piece of information is a little bit of evidence against your side. Even if you still think that there's a preponderance of evidence for your side, outweighing that little bit. I've noticed that people, it might actually have something to do with the halo effect as well, which is a heuristic that the brain uses in which if someone has certain positive traits, like say they're attractive, then you're likely to attribute other positive traits to them as well, even if they're completely unrelated. So the fact that you think one side is generally correct will make you less inclined to admit even small pieces of argument or small pieces of evidence against it, which I think looks like treating inductive situations deductively.
I think we're getting at the end of the Q&A even, so you want to wrap up things and.
All right, it's my bit.
Julia, before you do that,
yes.
Can I make my announcements?
I was going to do the announcements afterwards, but sure, now that we have it, go ahead.
Go for it.
Now that I've interrupted everything. After the podcast, we will have a social. Massimo will be signing copies of his books, and everyone will have an opportunity to show their support for the podcast and New York City Skeptics by donating the suggested $10 donation, or by becoming a member. We will also have some t-shirts for sale, and anyone who requires an elevator to get back upstairs, the main elevator is broken, we will have a Baruch staff member who can bring you to the freight elevator, okay, and bring you upstairs.
That's going to be fun.
That's going to be a blast, quite honestly.
Scenic route.
And everyone, we ask that when you exit this room, please exit through the downstairs doors, not these upstairs doors, okay? Which are behind you. Not these exit doors here, the ones right behind the stage where most of you came in. She'll be in the lobby down here.
But there will be a social out here.
There will be a social out here. We'll have refreshments.
Hang around,
we'll hang around, talk, chat, and if you're really lucky, you'll be in that elevator.
And now.
All right. Well, first, Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming down here to appear on our podcast. It's been a fantastic, wild ride of a conversation.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
And now, this concludes another episode of Rationally Speaking. Join us next time for more explorations on the borderlands between reason and nonsense. Thank you.